So there we are, 3 o'clock. I think that we slowly start this seminar. Very welcome to this Fondforum, where we will learn about the Canadian investment fund market and the recent introduction of a ban on inducements. Looking at the EU, we have the EU Commission that has proposed a ban on execution-only distribution. Ban on inducements for execution-only distribution of financial products. And the proposal has been discussed for a while now in Europe, and we also have negotiations that have started on European level. The outcome is not clear, but whatever happens on the EU level, there will probably be an upcoming discussion on a national ban in Sweden or not. The local supervisor have asked the government for an inquiry, so we will see what's coming out of that. My name is Fredrik Nordström, and I'm the CEO of the Swedish Investment Fund Association. And with me today, we have my colleagues from the Investment Funds Institute of Canada, Andy Mitchell, President and CEO, and also Arnie Hochman, Vice President, Policy and General Counsel. Very welcome to you. Yeah,
thank you.
You are with us. I just go through some practicalities. We have 1 hour plus 15 minutes, so we have time for questions, both during the presentation, but also I will curate the questions so we can have a lot of them at the end of the session. We are recording the link. We are recording, and the link will be found on the webpage as soon as possible. Yes, please ask questions. We have lots of time for that, I hope. So with that, Andy and Arnie, very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fredrik, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for this opportunity, and look forward to having a chat here. Hopefully, we can add some perspective on the work you're doing in your local markets. Fredrik, if you can move the slide forward, if you don't mind. I'm going to take the first little part here to introduce you a little bit to the Canadian investment funds industry and the marketplace here, to give you some perspective and some context. And then I'll pass it over to Arnie to actually dig into the OEO project and the regulatory change that we went through to address the specific issues here. And then we'll open up for questions, as Fredrik said. Fredrik, if you could go to the next slide, please. So to give you some data, and I'm sure there's other questions you may have around numbers, quite a large market actually in Canada for the size of our economy and the size of our population. One of the leaders I think we're in top 10 for sure as far as scale of assets in our marketplace. In the mutual fund world, we're approaching 2 trillion Canadian dollars in assets, and ETFs are growing quite extensively in the last number of years as well, approaching 400 billion in assets in the ETF space. The number of funds that we operate here are approaching 3,400. There would actually be more if you count the number of share classes of those funds, but those are the actual underlying funds that make up the marketplace. And the number of ETFs is just over 1,100. Locally, for the size of the market, we actually have a large number of managers. There's 120 mutual fund managers and 41 ETF managers in Canada. Next slide, please. We also, I think we shared some of this at the International Fund Association conference. Fredrik, you would have seen this, but to share with the rest of your audience, we do make quite a contribution to the Canadian economy. Contribution to the GDP from the Canadian investment funds industry is 37 billion dollars Canadian. We have 81,000 full-time jobs and a similar number of advisors in Canada as well, of which 16,000 of those advisors are CFPs and 15,000 are CFAs. In fact, we have the largest number, not percentage of market, but the largest number of CFAs in the world located here in Toronto. We punch above our weight. We have an economic multiplier of 1.21 for the Canadian economy, so we contribute more than some other industries in the marketplace here. And we provide a significant source of capital to the economy and to the investment industry overall, and our markets here of 370 billion dollars Canadian. Next slide, please. And then there is some uniqueness to our marketplace. I think there's some of these pressures and challenges and opportunities are global in nature, but we do have a bit of a unique market on a couple of comments I'll make here. We do an annual survey every year of Canadian investors and how satisfied they are with both mutual funds and ETFs and the advice channel that serves them. And we found in our latest survey last fall that investors are generally very satisfied with their advisors. If they have an advisor, they continue to transact with those advisors. But the reliance on advisors is on a slight decline, which is putting pressure on the delivery of advice. Obviously, there's some economic comments to make there with inflation and other things going on in the economy where people are budgeting appropriately and they may not be investing overall, not necessarily just not using an advisor. Hopefully that's going to change with better rate and environment and a less inflationary environment. The rise in direct investing is accelerating, especially in the digital side of things. Our OEO market is dominated by bank-owned organizations. There's not a lot of robo-advice much anymore in Canada. There was a move towards that, and a lot of players came into the marketplace. Most of that has settled down, and it's kind of clarified itself. And there is a need for new products and update to the service offerings in Canada. We are challenged somewhat on the innovation front because of the pressure of regulatory change and mandatory change within our businesses. So it's harder and harder for not only capital to be deployed there, but also people from a time management perspective and capacity perspective to invest in innovation. We're working hard on that, but it is a challenge for sure. The market itself is very unique as far as distribution goes. We are dominated by 6 Canadian local banks. They own the lion's share of the wealth space and the fund management space. Upwards of over 85% of assets and flows go through those channels. We also have 4 very, very large insurance companies in Canada that have both a fund manufacturing arm and large distribution entities in the thousands of advisors that not only sell their own product but also other product as well. But I will also say we have a very large independent landscape, both Canadian-owned independent fund manufacturers and also global names that you would know like Franklin Templeton, Invesco, Vanguard, BlackRock, PIMCO, Capital Group, all have very good franchises here and have a very good footprint of success in Canada in whatever market they choose to segment out their offerings into. And then our regulatory framework, which Arnie and his team lead. Arnie leads that for us with our members. Obviously, we're focused on investor protection. Our largest stakeholder is the end investor and the consumer of the advice. But it is a market under pressure right now. And as I said, back to the innovation and challenges that we're under pressure on, it is creating challenges for asset managers and dealers or distributors, you may call them, to find solutions. We do have quite a large independent distribution network as well. And we split I won't get into too many detail here to make it too complicated, but historically we've had really a mutual fund only distribution channel where advisors were registered to sell really only mutual funds. Most of them would have also sold insurance products. And then we had a more retail broker channel that could sell multiple products, mutual funds, as well as individual securities as well. Those 2 registrants now have come together as of January 2023. And now we have one regulator registering advisors, and that's going through its own process of significant change in the next couple of years as well. I will pause there, Frederick, and I don't know if you want to ask any questions based on those comments before I pass over to Arnie, or if there's any questions from the audience. If not, we can save those for the end.
Yeah, just to, so I follow you. 85% is distributed through the 6 banks.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. And yeah, but you do have the IFAs. How about execution only? How big is that, would you say?
As far as the actual marketplace, yeah. So the actual numbers of that almost 2 trillion in fund assets, it's only 41 billion in assets in the order execution landscape.
Yeah.
From a pure fund perspective, it's not significant. It's 2.1% of our total assets.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's and about 6% of the OEO assets are mutual funds.
Yeah. Okay.
Less than 6. So you can
Okay.
see people are either buying ETFs or individual securities, a lot of individual securities.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I'll pass it on to Arnie for the next slide.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and speak with you today. I'm sure the question you're all asking is whether or not a mutual fund company can pay for a dealer representative and their spouse to have dinner and attend a Maple Leaf hockey game and watch Willie Nylander and the other players play. And the second question you might be wondering is whether or not the answer to the question would have been different 30 years ago when Matt Sundin was playing for the Maple Leafs. So hopefully when I take you through the overview of the rules relating to sales incentives, the answers to those questions will become clear. So sales incentives rose to the fore as a major issue in Canada in the early 1990s. The Investment Funds Institute of Canada, or IFIC as I'm going to call it, came out with a code of conduct that was primarily focused on prospectus and point of sale disclosure. In 1996, that was revised to include substantive prohibitions on a variety of sales practices. And then with the advent of National Instrument 81105 in 1998, the vast majority of those sales practice substantive requirements were enshrined in the national instrument. So now we have an instrument which has the force of law applicable across Canada that has a series of very substantive prescriptive requirements. But in addition to that, it's really far broader in that it's got anti-avoidance provisions and it's got an underlying policy statement that says no sales incentive that produces an undue incentive for a representative that could place a client in basically in a disadvantaged position, if you will, where the representative is unduly influenced is acceptable. So that basically is the golden rule. The sales practice restrictions that I'm going to talk about are applicable to what we call participating dealers, which are dealers that are not affiliated with managers. So in other words, the dealer and the manager are independent of each other. And so for the most part, but for a few exceptions, which I'll get into, these rules do not cover what happens internally at universal banks, where they're involved in both the manufacturing and distribution of mutual fund securities. So the general prohibition is extremely broad. It says that no mutual fund manager or a related party can make a payment of money to a dealer or a dealer's representative, provide a non-monetary benefit to a dealer or dealer's representative, or pay or reimburse a dealer or dealer's representative for a cost. So your first question probably is, what's a non-monetary benefit? And simply put, that's something of value that could influence the actions of a sales representative. So examples of that are things such as trips, payment of trips, either foreign or domestic, the payment of entertainment, such as expensive hockey tickets, and or the meals relating to attending the game, gifts, attending educational conferences and courses, computer hardware and software, etc., etc. The definition is as broad as your imagination. And similarly, no dealer or dealer representative can receive a payment that cannot be made or can receive a non-monetary benefit. All of this is subject to certain permitted payments and non-monetary benefits. Slide, please.
Sorry, may I just put through a short question here, Arnie?
Sure.
Is this, what about sort of marketing services? How would it be possible for a execution-only platform to provide marketing services and charge the fund manager a fee for that?
Okay.
Or is
So
all transactions?
Yeah, so that's a really good question because that falls in a little bit of a gray area.
Mm.
And that's what makes this area so challenging. Despite the many, many words that are on the page, at the end of the day, it often comes down to judgment. There is a specific carve out for certain marketing activities, which is the payment of what we call co-op, which relates to sharing the costs of ads and conferences, investor conferences. The strict provision of marketing services that have value that you would otherwise pay a third-party consultant for, I would personally, and these are my own views, not necessarily IFIC's views, but I would think that's a non-monetary benefit. So I think the overarching concept is that a dealer should pay the own costs of operating its business, subject to some minimal inducements that can be paid or provided in the case of non-monetary benefits by a manufacturer to a dealer.
And is it
Now,
also,
I just go on to add, I guess the corollary would be, if the dealer were to pay fair market value for the services provided by the manufacturer, that would not be a prohibited activity.
Okay. And also, just to make things clear here, is this only a ban on that covers investment funds, or is it other investment products as well, or insurance products?
Yes, so also very good question. So National Instrument 81-105 pertains to mutual funds.
Okay.
So conventional mutual funds, alternative funds that have more latitude in terms of their investment goals and strategies are also mutual funds. They're also covered. And ETFs are also technically under our legislation mutual funds. So provided they're publicly offered by way of prospectus, these rules apply. So in other words, if one were carrying out some of these activities in what I'll call the private market, in privately placed funds, i.e. not offered broadly to the public, these prohibitions would not apply. So as it relates to insurance, the annuity products, as they're called in the US or in Canada, called segregated funds, same things. Variable annuities, segregated funds, they are not technically mutual funds in Canada. They are not subject to these rules. There are insurance rules around sales incentives, but nothing that I'm going to say today relates to what occurs in the insurance world.
Okay, thank you.
So what are the carve-outs? What are the prohibited activities? So the first is the payment of a commission for securities distributed, the payment of a trailing commission, except in the OEO channel, and certain portfolio trading commissions or spreads. What's prohibited would be providing what I'll call institutional trading activity to a dealer that distributes in consideration for the dealer distributing your funds. That would be an inappropriate incentive. However, given all the portfolio trading that's necessary, trading at fair market value, commissions and spreads, provided you obtain best execution, also in terms of price, speed, accuracy, etc., of the trading is permitted. Also in terms of the non-monetary benefits, as I alluded to earlier, the payment of cooperative marketing costs and educational practices are prohibited. Now, that's subject to a monetary cap, 50% of what we call the co-op payment, or holding the investor conference or seminar. Minimal promotional items and business activities are also permitted. And although it's quite rare these days, certain client rebates. An area that's also permitted under cooperative marketing and educational practices are conference attendances. And there are a whole variety of different types of conferences. Maybe I can speak about a couple in particular. The first would be conferences that are sponsored by the mutual fund managers, and their certain costs for a dealer representative attending can be paid, but they're very minimal, and they're basically the provision of meals. What's prohibited specifically are the accommodation costs and the travel costs. And in addition to that, the location has to be basically in continental North America, excluding Mexico. In other words, these conferences cannot occur in exotic locations. They can't be in Hawaii. They can't be in Italy, where you can have a day trip to see the Ferrari factory while you're attending the conference, unless you happen to have a major sub-advisor portfolio manager located in that foreign jurisdiction, and it's a bona fide trip to engage in some real detail with that particular portfolio manager. So in other words, these foreign trips sponsored by managers basically don't occur anymore. And if they do occur, they're under very tightly controlled circumstances. In terms of conferences run by dealers, there are several monetary caps associated with that. Only up to 10% of the costs of the conference can be paid by one particular manager, and ineligible costs include the same thing as we talked about earlier, accommodation and travel costs. So in other words, you can't do indirectly what you can't do directly. You cannot provide a trip, however it's couched, to a foreign, highly attractive location, and thereby provide an incentive to sell your funds. Just can't be done. There's an additional cap as well on dealer conferences that all managers in aggregate can't pay more than 66% of the cumulative cost. So in other words, again, the other guiding principle is a dealer should pay its own costs of running its business. So if it wants to hold a conference, whatever the purpose, it should largely bear the costs itself, unless there's certain bona fide costs that are paid by the manager. There are also rules relating to third-party conferences and industry association conferences. Probably not worth getting into detail about that. In terms of the minimal promotional items and promotional activities, things like pens, calendars, t-shirts, mugs, golf balls, those are all de minimis, not a problem. The occasional meal or the occasional ticket that doesn't have, and this is the kind of the difficult subjective determination, too high a value, is probably not offensive. It's all very much a fact-by-fact determination. So if today, going back to my Toronto Maple Leafs example, if the manager were to provide 2 tickets to spouses, $500 each, and pay for a meal that costs, say, $300, that's 1,300 Canadian dollars, that I think pretty clearly would not be on side. That would be a prohibited activity. So perhaps we can go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
There are other prohibitions. They were mentioned on an earlier slide. Charitable contributions can't be made where the tax slip goes to a representative. That's providing basically a monetary benefit to a representative if the manager pays it. Manager can't provide financial assistance to a dealer. Manager and dealers are prohibited from entering into tied selling arrangements, very common type of any competitive practice, which is usually banned under Competition Act. So there are a whole series of other things that are caught. And plus you have the overarching guiding principle wording that at the outset of the national instrument. Finally, we have a category of what are called principal distributors, and these are distributors that have a special relationship with the manager. Not always. but often they're within financial institutions where you have vertical integration and our universal banks. There are certain prohibitions on them, although the ones I've talked about don't currently apply, and I'll get into that in a minute. There are certain prohibitions that do apply to these principal distributors. For example, they can't pay higher trailing commissions or commissions on their own funds relative to third-party funds they distribute. They can't make higher payouts, higher percentage payouts of these commissions on their own funds relative to third-party funds. In other words, the playing field for proprietary and non-proprietary funds must be a level playing field. Now, our regulators are doing a significant review of sales incentives as they relate to principal distributors, and we're waiting the outcome of that review. So that is currently I would say, has a major question mark around it. Finally, rounding out the general sales prohibition requirements is disclosure required in the simplified prospectus. There must also be disclosure of equity interests held by dealers and their representatives in aggregate and fund managers. But that, because our universal banks are so predominant, there's a 10% minimum threshold below which one need not report. So that takes basic portfolio holdings out of the equation. And similarly, equity interests held by fund managers and dealers must be reported. So all of this is with a view to adding a second layer of protection for investors. First, we have substantive requirements with minimal carve-outs, and then we have disclosure of everything that is considered not to be an inappropriate sales practice. So that's our general regime. I'm wondering, Frederick, if this is a good place to stop and ask for questions or comments.
Yeah, I do have my own questions. I just need to ask my colleague, ser du om vi har några andra frågor? Jag ser inte. Okay. Yeah, I will stop sharing this. So, yeah, thanks. That's really interesting, Arnie. I just had some questions on the principal distributors where inducements or trailer fees are okay if they fulfill some requirements. And you said that they should be sort of a level playing field. Does mean that an equity fund can only pay the same inducement as an fixed income fund with much lower fees, for instance, or is it compared?
No. So for a specific given fund that's sold both by, I'll call proprietary channel and non-proprietary channel, the trailing commission must be the same between channels.
All right.
So what you're picking up on is the difference in trailing commissions for different types of products, and yes, they definitely vary by product type, but they can't vary by distribution channel type, except that they're precluded in the OEO channel.
Okay. And we don't have so much of the upfront provisions in the European or in the Swedish market, at least, not anymore. But is that common in the Canadian market that you have an upfront inducements as well, and then you have the trailing commissions?
So if you're talking about what we used to think of as quite a long time ago, where if you think of a corporate offering of securities, where the issuer of the securities, the corporation, would pay the dealer for distribution. That kind of what I'll call a new issue distribution model used to be quite prevalent in Canada. And it's not precluded, but it's not a current viable purchase method for clients. It really doesn't exist. So now commissions are so in terms of sales options, we have an upfront commission model where the dealer charges the client directly rather than as being paid by the manufacturer of the product. Most of the sales, frankly, are done at zero, for what we call zero front end load, which is for no sales commission. There used to be, prior to them being banned, what were called deferred sales charges and low load sales charge options. but they're no longer permissible. And that was a scenario where the manufacturer or a third-party financing entity did pay the dealers a sales commission in connection with the distribution of the product. Yeah. However, because that payment was made, there was a what I'll call a back-end sales charge payable by the investor should the investor redeem within X number of years from the date of purchase. And that was to protect the manufacturer who had paid an upfront sales commission to the distributor. So that's called, and I'm going to talk about that, and it's actually a good segue when we talk about the OEO channel. So if you try to remember that, that's called the DSC model, deferred sales charge model, is very important in the OEO discussion.
Okay. All right. I think that gives us a clear picture of the ban. And I remind the audience to send in some questions if it's something unclear. But you also said something about the tied selling. That's also that you sometimes see at the universal banks, or they're at least accused of that. What's the recommendations or the regulations around the tied selling? Is that
well, the basic rule? Yeah, so the basic rule is tied selling, which is making one product or services available only if a second product or service is also taken by the client. That is prohibited. What's not prohibited, and explicitly so, is relationship pricing, which is to say, if a client takes multiple products or services from the universal bank, and the universal bank provides a discount to the client because it's a valuable customer involved in many lines of business, that is not prohibited, and that is not technically tied selling.
Okay.
So there, as you might expect, there's been lots of discussion about that.
Yeah, we should probably clarify, I should have said this off the top, that all of the banks segment out their offerings. So their bricks and mortar retail bank branches, typically, maybe other than one, sell only their own funds. But then they have a broker dealer that offers all funds. They have an open product shelf. And then they have private client that would offer segregated portfolios with direct securities on behalf of their bank clients based on really the wealth spectrum. So, there's different layers of opportunity or things to sell.
So different fund universes, depending on where the client comes in and what type of client it is. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Is there anything to say why the ban was introduced? This is quite a small portion, the OE, the execution only part of the market. It seems not so dominant. It's just a couple of percent of the total market, as I understand. And why was the legislator interested on what was the problem and how was it defined? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big picture would be separating advice from non-advised, and just to remove that inducement, as your term uses it, from that channel.
Yeah. Okay. When we discuss it in Europe, it seems like a compromise, to be honest. We think that the Commission want to go for a full ban from the beginning, and then due to political compromises, they have sort of this ban on execution only that was presented. But in the discussions in Sweden, at least, we see that the problems with conflicts of interest are much greater in the advised sector, where the clients sort of trust their advisor, and the different inducements creates conflicts of interest, is said. And that's what the legislation tries to get the hands on, so to say. Do you have the same discussions in Canada? And is this just a first step, would you say, or is this taking care of the problems as they were perceived?
Yeah. So maybe would you mind, Andy, if I start?
Yeah, sure.
So I think it's important to lay the groundwork, and this will also feed into the OEO discussion when we get into more detail. The purchaser of a security, and they're generally series as opposed to classes in our world. So most of our mutual funds are trusts, some are corporations. The trust issue series, and as Andy mentioned earlier, there are also classes of securities that are issued by corporations. Predominantly we talk about series, but so I'll just refer to all these things as series. The way the advisor gets paid is reflected in both the purchase option selected by the client, which now is really pretty much zero front-end load. But it's also reflected in the particular series of units that the client buys. So for example, if a client is paying an asset-based fee to its advisor as opposed to being a commission-based account, that client would typically buy what we call Series F units or series. And they have a lower, they pay no trail commission because fees are being paid directly from the client to the dealer. Whereas if they buy Series A, there is a trail commit, and they have a they're paying no worry reduced trail for F. If they buy Series A, they're going to get a much higher trail fee, and they have a commission-based account. When you look at the total cost to the client of the fees they pay directly to their dealer and the fees directly paid to their manager, and you add them up, depending on what they can vary, and they're not always cheaper where the trail is a higher amount. Depending on the direct fees paid by the client to the dealer, the aggregate direct and indirect fees can actually be higher.
How much you mentioned in the beginning that the market is starting moving to a non-fee based advice market as well. Oh, sorry, a fee-based advice market. How big is the fee-based market compared to the commission-paid market?
So over 90% of new money moving from a fund to a fund or brand new investments being made are moving towards fee-based.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's quite a substantial move in the market then. Yeah. All right.
But to Arnie's point, it really hasn't changed the total cost to the client.
Yeah.
In fact, your question about trailer, typically trailer fees would be 100 basis points for any equity, all equity, or most balanced funds, and typically 50 basis points for a pure fixed income product.
That's the trailer fee.
Those are the typical trailer fees in the market. There is some exceptions to that, but that would be the standard. And then fee-based accounts are typically charged at least 100 basis points. So there's no real MERs have come down, but cost of advice has not really changed that much.
And what's the average fund fees if they pay 100 basis points in trailer commissions?
They have come down quite a bit. So we asked our research team here, and Ian Bragg, who you may have seen before, Frederick, in some of our reports. F class, as we mentioned, which is the fee-based share class, average is 88 basis points. And the direct channel, which is called D series for the OEO market, is 86 basis points.
Okay.
And that's across all asset classes. So there would be a variety of fees there, but that's the average for the entire share class. Yeah.
Okay.
So the evidence is that even if you were to take out embedded commissions, which is effectively the trail cost, out of the management fee, there's no clear evidence that would in any way reduce the cost, the aggregate cost of distributing and investing and getting asset management services from the manager. if you look at the downward pressure on management fees, yes, there may be some correlation with the disappearance of trailing commissions in the OEO channel, but it's much more likely to be influenced by ETFs, which have a much lower management fee. It's a substitute product.
Okay. We have some questions from the audience as well. And one that we have discussed in the Swedish market is that if you pay a fee-based income or fee to the advisor, then it's a VAT problem. That's is that the same in Canadian market?
It's a good question.
Do you
So in
pay
general
VAT?
terms, commissions are exempt from our version of VAT, which is called GST, HST. Commissions are not subject to commodity tax.
Okay. We also have a question on the definition of commissions. Could we sort of get back to that? And let's see, the question is, how do you define commissions and how do you differentiate commission from non-allowed payments to the investment advisor? So
commission in Canada, which Arnie highlighted, are really no longer. Commissions would be upfront at point of sale, earned fees for the advisor / distributor, versus trailer is an ongoing payment. And Arnie highlighted the monetary benefits that are prohibited and not prohibited. They're not deemed to be commissions. They're marketing allowances and other terms used for that.
Yeah. But on execution only, they are banned.
Yes, and commissions are now banned, which is the DSC terminology, deferred sales commission. We highlighted that is now banned as well from mutual funds. It's trailer only or fee only in the advice channel.
And we are usually quite proud of the Swedish market where the household participation is quite large. I would say that maybe 85-90% of the assets in investment funds in Sweden is coming from retail. How is the retail participation in the Canadian fund industry?
I don't know the exact numbers, but I can give you some perspective there that, the almost 2 trillion in mutual funds is retail. The pension market is about 560 billion. So the investment fund industry, which is used in various contexts of retirement and open accounts, is quite larger than our pension market.
Okay. So unit link solution is, you also mentioned that you have variable annuities and annuities. How big would you say that the unit link products are compared to the annuities?
I think the seg fund market, which is the insurance product, I think it's about 400 billion, Arnie. Does that sound about right?
It does sound about right, Andy.
Yeah. So again, smaller.
Okay. You said something also in the beginning that the reliance on advisors are declining. Is that why do you think that is? Is it because of technical improvement or the social media that you get advice sort of from other sources than you used to, or?
I probably have a number of comments to make there. I think it might be a snapshot in time. I think we're going to obviously track this over the next few years. Obviously, 2022 was a very difficult market from an advice and sales perspective. 2023 was not much better. I do think the economic environment in Canada and price pressures on individuals that may have sought out an advisor, particularly generationally, did not do so. We see that in the numbers. Our gross sales in the industry from a fund perspective are actually higher than previous years. So there is people putting cash into investments. But to give you a little more perspective, we're probably a mass affluent market that dominates the fund assets. 11% of Canadians own 86% of all financial assets in Canada.
Okay.
So we have a issue to build out more financial literacy as an industry for sure.
Yeah.
We're redefining what our role is there with our members to expand that. I think a lot of Canadians do rely on the social footprint from provided by government, which is fine and satisfying to make sure people are looked after. But it's a narrower portion of the population that is invested there. You know, you can see the growth in the OEO market. It's not growing substantially in assets, so it's not like they're leaving advisors and going OEO. I think people that didn't have an advisor have not sought out an advisor during this tougher economic time.
A technical issue on when we have discussed the ban proposed by the Commission in the European market, we have a problem in the Swedish market, since if you get an advice, you can see your funds on your account, and you can still choose on your own hand afterwards. So you get access to a service where you can see all hundreds of funds after you got the advice, so to say. The question that arises is that an advice, if you change a fund, or you take a portion from Swedish equity to Latin America that you find interesting, are you still an advised customer, or are you an execution only customer? Or have you discussed that, and have you a solution for that? Or can they change the funds on their own, the retail clients in Canada, after getting an advice? Or is it sort of a advice and execution service that they get from the advisors?
Arnie, I don't know if you have comments there, but I would say the easiest way to think about it is how is the transaction, no pun intended, executed? If it's done in an OEO brokerage account, then it's client executed. If you feel as a client of an advisor that you want to move from, say, Swedish equity to Latin American equity because you have a view of the economic opportunity, you would need to then review your KYC, your KYP. The advisor would have to go through a risk profile, make sure that's a suitable investment from a risk metric. Where in the OEO landscape, you still have a KYC, but you're taking on potentially more risk as you make those moves on your own in a non-advised scenario.
Okay, so there's no possibilities for an advised customer to change their investments on their own afterwards? No. Okay.
So I was wondering whether or not you were positing the scenario where the investor got advice in account one and replicated their trading in OEO account two. Or were you talking about a different scenario?
Yeah, the scenario is that you have a universal bank, and you go to the bank and you get advised. They receive trade commissions since it's legal, so to say, but then you look at your account after half a year and you see, this fixed income fund looks really boring. I want a Latin America instead, and you do a change. You change your fund investments for a portion of your fund for your holdings or all of it, and then that would be possible, I guess, in most of the services or solutions that we have in the Swedish market. So I just wonder, is that possible even in the Canadian market, and how would the customer that acts like that be considered as still an advised customer, or have they left sort of the advised community and become an OEO?
So I think, okay, so I think there are two scenarios. As Andy said, if you wish to stay within your advice-based account and the investment exposure, new investment exposures you want to take on are appropriate given all your circumstances. In other words, they're suitable, and the risks are disclosed to you and so on. You're free to do that. That's option A. Option B is, if for whatever reason you want to leave your advice-based account in whole or in part, you can open up an OEO account and you can do whatever you like
Mm.
because suitability is not a factor.
Mm. Okay. So in both cases, you're leaving the advice, the foundation for a commission, trailing commission is not there anymore since you have left the advised service.
In the second scenario, yes.
And the second, okay. So okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is just because we also thinking there is another issue we have with the proposals in Europe. I haven't prepared you for this, but it's also that sometimes we don't have fund share classes like you mentioned now, the F class and the D class. You have specific names for certain. We just call them clean share classes so far in Sweden, but it's not necessarily so that the fund industry look forward to a scenario where they will only have one clean share class. Maybe they will have different clean share classes on depending on the size of the client or the size of the distributor, the market power the distributor has. So would that be possible? First of all, could you have different F classes with different fee structures? Or is there only,
Yes.
yeah, okay,
No,
so
we have, first of all, we have a real alphabet soup, we call it, because
okay.
there's more than F and D. There's I, O, A.
Okay.
An old firm I ran had an E class. I mean, there's, you can design it any way you wish. I think for simplicity reasons, F and D have become the predominant ones. The A share is the old DSC share class. And you can have different levels. In fact, a number of years ago now, I want to say within the last decade for sure, there was F1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As your wealth increased, as you added more assets, or as the assets grew by capital markets growth, you would jump to a lower fee. So you move from F1 to F2 and you pay less, and then F2 to F3, etc. That is kind of moved away for simplicity reasons. Some firms still offer it. So there is commercial, let's call it strategic choices fund manufacturers can make to do that as long as they're within the compliance umbrella.
Okay. So the only thing that you can only, as a fund manager belonging to a universal bank, you cannot pay the bank higher trailing commissions than anyone else that you distribute through. All right.
Correct. And I think that, the KYP, as we call it, the know your product due diligence that distributors are accountable for now, they have to ensure that they have a fair playing field across all their products that they offer, so that there's not, extra incentive to utilize one product over another, as Arnie mentioned, whether it's your own product that you manufacture or even an independent organization that may provide you products for your solutions.
Mm. Mm-hmm. It's still possible to ask some questions. If anyone has something to ask, please just put forward in the Q&A. I don't know what to ask you.
Would you like me to talk a little bit about the OEO experience?
Yes, please. The effects. Yes, please. Thank you.
Sure. So when the OEO trail ban was introduced, it became very clear very quickly it was going to be very, very complex. Unfortunately, there was no magic button to push where simply trail commissions stopped being paid in the OEO channel. And the world just progressed merrily along with virtually no change. It was actually quite the opposite. It turned out to be a highly complex implementation for the dealers. They required substantial systems changes, operational changes, internal control changes, review of their internal compensation practices, and client fees. They had to figure out how they were going to get paid by their clients. So very complicated. On the fund manager side, the funds had to review all of their series offerings by channel, in particular to focusing on what was held in the OEO channel. And the rule was adopted in September 2020. We did a highly detailed Gantt chart for the regulators showing the challenges for implementation. And that resulted in an 18-month plus implementation period to actually get this working appropriately. And we needed every day of the 18 months, basically. And we also needed regulatory relief so that things could work appropriately. So maybe I just give you a little bit more color on that.
Yeah.
Because you wonder, well, how is that possible? Something so seemingly simple as stopping trail commissions could take so long and involve so much complexity. So the first task for OEO dealers and managers was to determine holdings on OEO platforms. Well, it turned out that many entities, primarily banks, but not necessarily banks, held single dealer accounts for multiple dealers. So they would have an OEO dealer, a full service dealer, maybe a high net worth dealer, all of which entered their trades through a single dealer number. And so when the manager looked at its books, it couldn't differentiate OEO holdings from non-OEO holdings. That became an enormous challenge. Secondly, the investment fund managers had no insight necessarily into all of the individual security holdings at the dealer level. One problem is that once you identified what the holdings were in the OEO channel, you couldn't simply you couldn't simply have the client stay in the same series of units, because you cannot pay, because of the way the systems work, no trail on, let's call it Series A, held in the OEO channel, and trail paid on Series A held in the full service channel. So therefore, the only way to curtail the trail paid in the OEO channel and have the client realize a lower management fee was to have the client move into a different series, hopefully within the same fund, for its OEO channel holding. And so then the problem became, well, in every case, was there an identical series in all respects that just had a lower management fee where you could move the client into that series? Option A. Option B, if it wasn't identical, was it highly similar such that you felt comfortable moving the client into that series? So maybe the series they were in paid a minimal distribution of 4% per annum, and you wanted to move the client into another series. Everything was identical, same investment exposure, lower management fee, everything you want, but no guaranteed 4% payout. Well, was that okay? The regulators agreed that was okay. So basically we found the same or similar series within the existing funds. One small problem, the dealers as OEO dealers had no authority to move the clients from Series A, for example, to Series F. They're dealers, they're not discretionary asset managers, they're not licensed to do that. So they have problem with both the securities regulators and the SROs, self-regulatory organizations. In addition, in some cases where there was no like-to-like or like-to-similar, there was no option other than to say, well, we'll move you to another fund, which is similar. But for holdings in taxable accounts, that would cause a tax event. So it would not necessarily create new tax, but it would accelerate tax payable. Securities regulators found that unacceptable. They said, why don't you create new series of units to accomplish this within the same fund? Well, the only problem with that is the reason they don't exist is they're highly uneconomic to create new series. So then we went to the next iteration, which was for managers to pay rebates to the clients So they would charge the full amount of the management fee, kind of basically inclusive notionally of the trailing commission, and then rebate the trailing commission back to the client. The manager could do that, except most managers didn't have that systems capability. Another option was to have the dealers basically do the same thing. But they needed securities law relief from the regulators in order to do that. So now we have securities law relief to do these discretionary trading activities, which frankly they told us we didn't need, and we said, okay, if that's your view, we'll take it. They told us not to worry about it. That didn't necessarily mean we had authority from the client to do it. All that meant is we weren't going to have a compliance issue with the securities regulator. But because the industry said we're basically going to reduce your fees, even though there was an issue about not having technical authority, sort of the analysis was no harm, no foul. So then we figured out a way basically to deal with all the existing assets. And then the question became, well, what do we do with it? What do we do about new assets? So new sales of trailer paying series had to be stopped. But in place, there were tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of what we call automatic purchase plans, where clients provided ongoing instructions to continue to buy, more of the following security in perpetuity until we tell you to stop. Automatic purchase plan. Well, those had to all be stopped because the plans were to buy a class of securities that they could really no longer hold in the OEO channel. So all of those plans had to be changed basically unilaterally by the party responsible for the plan. Again, without any necessary authority to do that. No client direction. It just needed to be done. Then the question became, well, what about assets that transfer in from, say, the full service broker-dealer model to the OEO channel? How do you deal with those? Because you can't separate out mutual funds from other securities that transfer. So either all the securities transfer or none of them transfer. So we transfer in the securities that pay trailing commissions. The receiving dealer needs some time to figure out, to identify that, figure out how to move the client. But that can't happen instantaneously. So therefore, for some period of time between receipt of the securities and transferring to a new series, the dealer was technically offside because it was going to receive the trailing commission for that number of days, X number of days over 365 times the annual rate.
And in that case, Arnie, we should clarify that still continues.
Okay.
Because the client doesn't know that they need to change from A series to D series before they transition. They may not even inform their advisor that they're transferring out their account. So they will just go to the OEO dealer and say, I want to transfer this account number to you. And that new OEO dealer will acquire a trailer-based asset, which then needs to be corrected. And that will go on maybe forever until the consumer is more aware of the change needed to be made before the transfer is happening. But the dealers are given the right and the time to clean that up, as Arnie's alluding to, and clean it up over time.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Andy, because it's all about the client experience. We had endless discussions with the regulators, and they were very good. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. They were very good, but we did explain to them, we can't have a back and forth discussion between what I'll call the terminating broker and the new broker. They may be affiliates, they may not be affiliates. The client has made a decision to move the assets. The last thing you want is a roadblock in front of the client who's made a decision. What we call the relinquishing broker is probably trying to retain the assets. And the question is this going to be another roadblock to prevent the client doing what they want to do? It's going to be basically a disaster for all parties. So the end accommodation was to let the assets go and worry about fixing up the asset series once the monies and the fund holdings were over at the OEO dealer.
So if we look at the industry as a whole, have you seen what is the broad effects? Can you say that the fund fees have come down? You said that they have in some cases on the OEO platforms. But on the other hand, there are new fee structures implemented. And the total cost for saving investment funds from retail, would you say that has that changed, or?
Yeah, it has slowly moved down, but to Arnie's
Yeah.
point earlier, I do believe that's not a factor necessarily of OEO in the change of removing trailer. I think it's a function of awareness, because we have various regulatory initiatives making consumers more aware. So we want them to be literate of what they're buying, and they have the opportunity to have that conversation with their advisor. I think there's economies of scale as firms have gotten larger and larger. They can be more efficient and effective in their own management, and thus keeping their margin, but enabling them to lower some costs for their client. And I do think, to Arnie's point earlier, in the retail space, ETFs in Canada played a significant role in awareness of costs.
Yeah.
We actually have a more active ETF space than a passive, which is interesting from a global perspective. We have a larger active ETF market than we have a AUM versus the passive side. So we still have active ETF fees, but they're lower than funds.
Yeah.
And that's driving awareness and putting pressure on overall pricing.
You also mentioned that the fee for an account, advice covered account, so to say, that was around 100 basis points. Is
Correct.
that okay? And for an OEO platform, if you have an account on an OEO, how much would you pay for that in
No ongoing fees, only trading fees. So transactional fees as you trigger a transaction.
Yeah.
Again, depending on the entity, it can be $10, $25 per trade, etc.
Oh, so you don't pay any value-based fee for the account? No. Okay, interesting. So that's differs from the execution-only platforms we have in Sweden. But if you look at that, it seems like the OEO, there is a large interest of ETFs in the Canadian market, and then you have the OEO channel, where it sounds like it's quite cost efficient. And you also mentioned that you had the reliance of advice was declining. For me, that sounds like you would have an overflow from the advised accounts to OEO platforms, but that's not. Have you seen that, or is that not prevalent in the market?
No, I don't think it's pervasive. Arnie, I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments or stats, but as I said before, I think it's in the short term, and we're going to monitor this for sure. In the short term, I think it's an economic question more than anything else. I don't think necessarily from our study and our survey, investor clients are leaving their advisor. It's that those that don't have an advisor are not getting an advisor, and that could be economics. It could be generational. We've got to obviously measure that to make sure that we're supporting more investors investing wisely for their own benefits to meet their goals. That's a separate function of that data, and it's not significant either, Frederick. It's a slight decline, but it's noticeable.
Yeah.
The satisfaction rates with advisors in Canada is over 95%. So those that have an advisor are very, very satisfied with their advice and are very comfortable paying the cost of that advice.
Has the market found it's difficult to impose new fees for when it goes from a trailing commission-based system to a fee-based system? Has it been problematic to introduce new kind of fee structures on the clients for the advised?
I don't think from the client perspective. I think the people that are probably struggling with the most in the Canadian marketplace, and maybe this would have been a few years ago, are probably advisors. Yeah. having to change their conversation and change their model.
Yeah.
And like we've highlighted, the cost of a trailer-based solution for a client versus a fee-based account is not really material. It's the total cost of that advice process is very, very similar. So it really is an advisor choice and client choice as to how they execute on those fees. And now we have full disclosure. We have a major project, I think I shared with you at the conference. We have a major project called total cost reporting, where we're going to share every single penny of every charge that the client pays on their annual statement starting in 2 years' time.
Okay, so that's both the payments for the account and also for the investment funds. So that's aggregated. Yeah, sounds good. And looking at if we are representing the fund industry, what's the effects on the fund industry? Have you seen any problems for independent investment fund managers to find distributions?
I would say those that don't have a diverse product lineup and maybe distribution partnerships would be struggling somewhat in Canada. I don't think that's again a factor of any of the initiatives we talked about today. I think it's a factor of a very well invested mature marketplace with a demographic that is aged towards retirement. So you've got decumulation happening at the same time as new money coming in. We're probably like other global markets right now. We have a lot of cash on the sidelines that will enter back in the markets, but we also have a large number of firms, as I mentioned, 120 managers and 41 ETF managers. That's a large audience of managers for the scale of our marketplace. And some of them are struggling to expand and grow for sure.
And would you say that there have been any unintended consequences that the supervisors have put their eyes on, or is everything going according to plan?
In the OEO channel specifically, there were, I don't believe, unintended consequences. There was a huge amount of effort put in up front to identify all of the issues. I do want to emphasize the importance of an investor communication plan. When you think of all these assets being moved, both existing assets and changes for new assets, and the effect on their automatic purchase plans and so on, the sheer amount of paper and telephonic discussion with clients was quite significant, so that they weren't surprised by what occurred. I'm sure the customer service desks were extremely busy after this was all executed on.
Especially if they find themselves with a new fund.
Exactly. And also don't forget, this was happening during COVID.
And it was extremely important to talk to the regulators about this, because I've alluded to a number, but definitely not all of the issues that arose. And the regulators were extremely helpful. I mean, they clearly had their objectives, and we executed to those objectives, but they understood our constraints, including the timing to make it happen, and we worked very well with them. They provided the necessary relief so that there could be a smooth transition.
Super. We are closing in for the end. Is there any more questions from the audience? No, not really. Andy and Arnie, thanks a lot for. No, we have one question. Do advisors generally charge based on assets under management, or do some charge per hour?
There's a small segment of hourly charges. There's also those that charge just for a financial plan and don't do any execution of any product solutions at all. But the majority of the market, large majority, would be charged on AUM. The fees would be charged on AUM. Yeah.
Okay. Super. Andy and Arnie, thanks a lot for taking your time to talk to us about these interesting issues. And we will stay in contact. Andy, you have asked me some questions of what's happening in the Swedish market and also European market. I'm happy to stay in touch with you. And to the audience, now you know where to find them. And if you can bombard them with more questions if you have any. Thanks a lot for taking your time.
No problem.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.